Calgary National Coaching for Parasport Summit and the Calgary Adapted Hub powered by Jumpstart. My name is Letitia. I am the Research and Knowledge Translation Coordinator for the Calgary Adapted Hub. And on your screen, you will also see Ashley, who is our program manager. We'll combine moderate this session today. So to lead off, I would like to start with our land acknowledgement, recognizing that the University of Calgary is located in the heart of Southern Alberta, and both acknowledging and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Today, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Townsend, who is a senior lecturer in sport coaching and pedagogy at the University of Waikato. Am I even close?
Yeah, that was pretty good. Good. It's Waikato.
Waikato. His primary interest is in coaching and coach development, with a particular focus on disability sport. Rob is a former high-performance coach in disability sport and currently heads up the Disability Sport and Active Recreation Research Group at the University of Waikato. Closer.
Nice.
Which focuses on developing programs of research in partnership with the disability sport sector, including organizations such as Sport New Zealand. He is a member of the ICCE Para-Coach Working Group, providing consultancy to the European Paralympic Committee and Paralympics New Zealand on coaching and coach development. Rob is also the Oceania representative for the International Federation of Adapted Physical Activity and an invited member of the Virtus Scientific Committee. Welcome, Rob. I will pass it over to you, and once you wrap up your presentation, then I will introduce our panelists.
Okay. Thank you, Letitia. Shall I start to share my screen?
Yeah.
I think that might be a good start. You let me know if this looks about right.
Looks good.
Look pretty good. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining today, and thank you, Letitia, and the committee for organising this for me and for giving me an opportunity. Still really nerve-wracking doing things on Zoom. I'm not sure how I'm going to go when we start doing things in person again. So hopefully I don't stumble too much. And I've not had a coffee this morning, so apologies if I say anything weird or my voice breaks at any point. That's probably why. So as Letitia said, I'm Rob Townsend. I work at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, originally from the UK, where I did my PhD at Loughborough University. I'm conscious that this talk today is being given in conjunction with the National Coaching for Parasport Summit, and I did a shorter presentation last week. And so hopefully today I can offer a bit more of an expanded commentary. When I was asked to do this talk, I was given a pretty broad remit. And so I've used this quote, "People are afraid of things they don't know," in order to try and capture the central theme of my work, which is around disability sport and essentially understanding how coaching knowledge and coaches' practices can function as a barrier to inclusion, and also to try and unpack some of the things that we can do about that in coach development to try and address it. So a little bit of background. My research primarily brings together the fields of disability, sports coaching, and I draw on qualitative research to try and make sense of these kind of things. And today I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot of some research that I've been doing over the last few years, drawing from my PhD and beyond, to try and unpack how ableism sits at the foundations of parasport coaching and coach education. And so, as Letitia mentioned in my intro, my research in disability sport is it's influenced by my own background as a coach in disability sport. And so my experience of working in disability sport or parasport has been predominantly shaped by working with athletes at the elite level with intellectual impairments and neurodevelopmental disorders, which culminated in 2 years with the England National Learning Disability Cricket Squad. Hopefully many of you in Canada have heard of cricket. And I was also head coach of a disability talent development centre for athletes with physical, intellectual and neurodevelopmental impairments. Now, I think my experiences across these different contexts have at times included things like uncertainty, not knowing what to do, anxiety, not wanting to get involved. At the same time, they've also provided me with some of the most profound and impactful learning experiences as a practitioner. And I really valued some of the relationships that I've built with the players and the staff that I worked with. Currently, I've transitioned into working at a university and teaching on courses around sport, coaching, coach development, and disability and inclusion. And obviously doing research around these areas too. I also, again, as Letitia mentioned, I head up a small research group, and our focus is on working with sports organisations, particularly those that are responsible for coach development, and working with them to identify some problems that research can help solve. So this is just a very small snapshot of some of the papers that we've had in the last year or so from the research group. We've got some really interesting work and some really talented early career researchers doing some stuff around para-athlete welfare, disability sport policy, talent identification, talent development, and athletes' uses of assistive technology. And more recently, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, we've more recently secured some funding from Sport New Zealand over a couple of years to look at para-coach education. Now, throughout the presentation, I have dotted some QR codes into the presentation. Feel free to take a snap of those. They take you to some stuff that will help support what I'm saying. In this case, it will take you to a research profile where you can download some of these papers for free. So if you are you're interested in some of the stuff that's going on in that research group, please do check them out. Now, I want to give a very, very quick rationale about why we're having these kind of conversations and why we're even talking about disability sport and bringing in coaching to discuss this. I hope that given the audience today, I don't think I need to convince many of you why these sorts of things are important, but it's important to recognise that historically disability has sat at the margins of sport. And so I think it's worth reiterating that first and foremost, disabled people have a right to participate and to excel in sport, which means providing access to sports pathways and opportunities to get and to stay active. I think the key thing at the moment is we're seeing this explosion of interest in disability, in parasport, Paralympics. And it's important to note that despite this, and despite this heightened representation and heightened visibility of disability, not all disabled people have those same privileges. Not all disabled people are sufficiently active and are given opportunities to perform and excel. And I will say at this point, many of you will be thinking, well, he's saying disabled person, not person with a disability. That's just a contextual thing that we use in New Zealand and in the UK. I totally support whichever language is your preference. Essentially, my use of disabled people is to try and highlight that for me, disability is a social barrier. It's a political category, and it's worth highlighting discrimination through highlighting the imposition of disability. Also, I think that coming back to disability sport, there's a growing body of research now around disability sport coaching, para-coaching, and it's starting to argue that coaches are one of the most important, if not the most important figure in shaping sporting experiences for disabled people. Coaches provide opportunities for high quality participation, as well as maximizing elite performance. However, a lot of the research that takes para-coaching as its object of inquiry, it starts with an understanding of para-coaching from an able-bodied perspective. And so my view is that given that disability is a socially constructed thing, we need to start understanding and examining the structures that underpin coaches' knowledge and coach development in parasport coaching. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into why I'm doing any of this and why it's important. Now, my talk today is about ableism and the different variants of ableism and how it can manifest in para-coaching. And I think that for me, and it's something that I've come to relatively recently, but ableism is a fundamental starting point for understanding parasport. And in the last couple of years, some colleagues and I again, the QR code will take you to an example of this. But yeah, in the last couple of years, some colleagues and I have started to explore ableism as a belief system that underpins coaching knowledge in parasport, as a means of generating awareness and trying to create some resources to try and challenge ableism or to take an anti-ableist stance. Ableism itself is a system of beliefs. It's a system of practices that positions able-bodiedness as superior, as the norm. And as a result, disabled people are often positioned as other within ableist environments. The key thing is ableism is often quite subtle and it works covertly. It can manifest in lots of different ways, and we can see these different manifestations in disability sport. For example, often we'll hear that disability sport is devalued compared to able-bodied sport. It can manifest through the perpetuation of what we call supercrip or superhuman narratives, this notion that disabled people can only achieve if they overcome their impairment. It's this kind of negative view of disability. We also see ableism in the way that the media prioritizes certain bodies, predominantly those autonomous, independent, athletic disabled bodies in high performance sport. Now in coaching, it can manifest in a number of different ways. And I've just put here, it can manifest in coach education, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But primarily, we need to start thinking about the way that ableism is inherent in the way that we think about sports facilities, the equipment that we have access to as coaches, and also the opportunities that are available for disabled people to participate in. And my own work is trying to draw on ableism as a knowledge system, which is based on able-bodied values. And therefore, we can try and unpick how coaches are educated about disability. And so simply my point here, I guess, is that I think that ableism sits at the foundations of sport coaching. And therefore, we need to think about it when we're exploring parasport. However, there are lots of different variants and examples of ableism. These might be things like benevolent ableism. These might be things like neoliberal ableism or institutional ableism, for example. But I want to talk about enlightened ableism. Now, the picture on the slide encapsulates the core of enlightened ableism. Essentially, beliefs, processes, or practices that unintentionally exclude or restrict opportunities for disabled people, despite rhetoric to the contrary. We tend to see enlightened ableism at the heart of most top-down sports policies, whereby sports organizations, for example, are encouraged to be more inclusive and more diverse, but the power of those discourses, those policies are diluted through a lack of funding, a lack of initiatives, a lack of training and support, and through potentially derogatory attitudes towards disabled people. So it's this idea that despite enlightened rhetoric, the practices that marginalize disabled people are still perpetuated. And I think that it's a really nice way of looking at para-coaching and coaching. And I think that in coaching itself, enlightened ableism can exist in coaching environments where disability outwardly is valued and important, and coaches talk about progressive acceptance and disability inclusion and things like athlete empowerment. But their beliefs and practices still, again, unintentionally, devalue, exclude, or marginalize disabled people. So I wanted to really have enlightened ableism in the back of our mind as I'm talking today, and I'll try and draw this out throughout the presentation. So I know so far that we're sitting at quite an abstract level. I'm sorry for that, but I want to give you some examples. So as I said at the start, I spent a couple of years coaching in high performance disability sport. But at the same time, I was doing my PhD, I was researching, I was reading critical disability theory, I was reading researchers like Dr. Daniel Peers and Professor David Howe. And I began to feel really uncomfortable with some of the things that were being said and that were framing the environment, the coaching environment that I was working in. In particular, the way that some of my colleagues and some of my peers were talking about their approaches to coaching the athletes. So outwardly, the environment that I was in, the National Learning Disability Squad, it was built on progressive and enlightened ideals and intentions, in particular around supporting players to be brave, to develop their life skills, to be independent, and to challenge themselves. But from a more critical perspective, and as I read more and I was starting to engage more in critical disability theory, I felt that lots of these things that were being said had hidden meanings, and that they disguised sets of power structures in ways that might further marginalize the disabled athletes. So here are some examples on this slide of some data from one of my studies. The first one is some data from the performance director that I worked under, as well as one of my my coaching colleagues. I think the notion that disability sport lacks credibility without a performance focus is quite interesting, as well as the blanket refusal from my colleague to acknowledge disability in his day-to-day practice. And on the one hand, I can see that these are outwardly, intentionally trying to be empowering, and they're an attempt to focus or shift the focus away from negative disability-specific associations. But as I read more and as I reflected on these things, I feel like they're based on sets of knowledge and practice that are transposed or imposed from able-bodied sport onto parasport. And I think that the key thing is that here in this kind of environment, the players, rather than the coaches, are the ones having to make up the difference. And I think the issue was that those that didn't fit in with this environment that we were building based on able-bodied values, those that didn't fit in dropped out very quickly. So in this sense, we ended up working in an environment where only those that most closely aligned with able-bodied high performance values were the ones given the most attention and given the most value. So I think a nice example there of two things happening at once, intentionally trying to be progressive, intentionally trying to be empowering, but also unintentionally being ableist. And that kind of shows you how enlightened ableism works in coaching. At the same time, these ideas about disability, performance, and elitism can have more concerning implications. And I guess the key point that I'm trying to make here is that the walk from enlightened ableism to overt and more damaging ableism, evident in the quote from the strength coach, is not that far. So, in terms of these studies, there is more information available at this QR code. I will say that the data from these studies is really, really interesting. And so there's a couple of examples here where I've talked about my experiences of coaching in high performance sport, and I've tried to analyze those using a more critical lens. I've also reflected on my own background and my own struggles with negotiating an academic identity and a practitioner identity. So if you are interested in those, or if you're struggling to sleep at night, give those a go. I'm sure they'll help. But some of the data within those papers is pretty interesting. So the next part of my presentation today is a more clear and more overt focus on coaches' learning and coaches' knowledge. And so a second focus of my research in the last few years has been on exploring para coaches' learning and development. And so this is another way for me in which enlightened ableism can manifest in coaching. Now, the quotes that I'm going to put on the slide here are from a study that I did back in, I think it was 2017, where I followed an autism-specific coach education course for 2 years, and I evaluated its impact on coaches' learning, specifically looking at the way in which coaches change their understandings about autism, develop confidence, and develop perceptions of their own competence. Now, 2 things stood out from the research that I've done in para coaches' learning. One, it's really, really common for coaches who work in disability sport to describe their experience as being framed by trial and error, and as this coach's quote suggests, being dropped in at the deep end without much support. For others, coaching in parasport is something to be avoided due to a fear of the unknown. And that's something that, through engagement with the sector here in New Zealand, we've seen a lot of mainstream sports organizations, and I use that word in air quotes, struggling to do disability work because a lack of a competent, confident workforce. And this is a social barrier, and this is something that we need to address. So in terms of that fear of the unknown, there's a really nice quote here from a gymnastics coach from that study. And I think it's illustrative of the stigma that's often attached to disability and the lack of disability-specific knowledge in coaching. This idea that I'm completely out of my depth, I don't know how to speak to these people, I don't know if I should look at them, you don't know anything, and it's really frightening. And the point is, the coach says here that, the point is you don't know what you're doing and you're let loose on people who can be challenging, and that's how you feel. And so this is an example of where coaches' knowledge, coaches' attitudes, coaches' confidence is positioned as the key barrier to disabled people getting active and accessing sport. And I think that this is something that we can really change through some progressive coach development opportunities. And I guess the point that I'm trying to hammer away at here is that the parasport literature points to issues about either the availability of or the effectiveness of disability-specific coach education and training. And also, coaches are telling us they want more training and they want more support to work with disabled people. And this is really important at an organizational level. If you're trying to work to policies that are asking you to be more diverse and more inclusive, and if you want to expand opportunities for participation and performance, then you need to invest in and support your coaches. And if, like this coach describes here, coaches are entering parasport without any training or support, which seems to be a common situation, then it's really understandable that exposure to an increasingly wide range of abilities and needs can lead to most coaches, or some coaches at least, feeling uncertain and inadequately prepared. So I think we need to take a really critical look at para-coach education, or coach education systems in general. So one key challenge, as I mentioned, is that coaches are largely untrained in disability. And by this, I mean that in general coach preparation pathways, either at university level or at national governing body or national sports organization level, disability exposure is really low in those kind of pathways. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, disability is often separate from or absent completely from general coach preparation pathways. And the research tells us currently that, with few exceptions, there are two ways in which coaches learn about disability through more formalized pedagogical structures. So not just trial and error, but through formal coach education. These are what I've called categorical and inclusion approaches. And I think that, and I'll talk about this in a second, but these approaches to the way to educating coaches about disability, they reflect particular ways of thinking about disability, what we call models of disability. And they emphasize particular aspects of the disability experience and then prescribe knowledge based on those aspects. And also, these different approaches sit on an integration scale, starting from completely separate from general coach preparation pathways to fully infused across coach development. And I think this is a really important distinction, or a really important point for us to make, because in positioning disability as separate from normal, again in air quotes, coach education, we're illustrating the impact of enlightened ableism, i.e. we know that learning about disability is important, but it's not that important. Okay, so the first form of para-coach education is something that I've called a categorical framework. And this is arguably one of the most dominant ways of thinking about disability coaching. Now, categorical approaches are underpinned by a medical model of disability, which emphasizes a technical language and a specialized body of knowledge specific to impairment. And so categorical approaches focus on the dissemination of impairment-specific information. And this might be through different means. It might be through online modules, it might be through one-day or half-day face-to-face workshops, or it might just be through resources, booklets, or infographics. Now, the key thing here is that categorical approaches are really prescriptive. They base coaching knowledge primarily on the management and intervention of certain types of impairment. So this approach reinforces the notion that disability resides in the individual, which is obviously counterintuitive to inclusion. And so the study that I mentioned earlier, where I was evaluating an autism-specific coach education program, that was based around a categorical framework. And one of the most damaging impacts of these types of coach development that I've found and I've seen was the perpetuation of stereotypes and generalizations about impairment, particularly autism, to the point where during some scenario-based learning episodes, I would observe able-bodied coaches taking on the role of disability, of autism, and acting disabled. And this was seen as a really good thing in terms of generating realistic, again in air quotes, knowledge about coaching. And I think if we take a step back, can we consider in what other situation is able-bodied people pretending to be disabled either an ethically defensible or appropriate learning intervention? But I've seen it happen, and it happened for pretty much 2 years in a categorical framework to coach education. So the QR code takes you to that study that I did. Even if you want to just read the data, just check out some of the data that we saw that's within that paper. It's really interesting in the way that coaches start to speak about autism. Now, a second approach to educating coaches about disability is what we call an inclusion approach. And so inclusion approaches are still separate from general coaching pathways, but the focus is more on coaches' understandings of inclusive practice. So again, these might be delivered through online modules or face-to-face workshops. And they present coaches with reflective thinking tools, models for adaptive practice. Some of you in the room might have heard of things like STEP or tree models, or the activity inclusion model from the UK. These are what we call adaptive practice frameworks, and they provide coaches with ideas for activity differentiation. These kind of workshops also outline information about barriers to participation in sport, particularly things like social barriers, physical barriers, and attitudinal barriers. And these approaches are generally a little bit more reflective. They take the emphasis away from the disabled person, from the disabled athlete, and they ask coaches to reflect on the disabling aspects of coaching practice. But the focus is on inclusion in these frameworks. But often what we're actually talking about is integration, where the ableist notions of ability that underpin these practice structures are not challenged, which again is a prime example of enlightened ableism. And so in looking at these kind of inclusive approaches, they reflect what I call a pre-social model of disability, something that we observed in special education back in the 1960s, particularly in the UK, which is where it's about integrating disabled athletes into a pre-existing set of structures rather than true inclusion. And again, the QR code will take you to an example of this type of coach development. And now the third approach, and one that is particularly rare, I think, despite it being advocated for in kinesiology and physical education for over 30 years, is an infusion approach. Now, coaching's been really, really slow on the uptake of an infusion approach. Now, an infusion approach is based on the social relational model of disability. It encourages a relational approach to coaching, which looks at things like the disabling aspects of coaching practice, develops coaches' relational behaviors, things like their communication, and gives consideration to, but it's not led by, the impact of impairment effects. And I've given an example here of the NCCP program, but in an infusion approach, disability content is woven throughout existing coach development pathways like the NCCP, as well as their curricula, in order to enhance coaches' reflective capacities, their practice repertoires, in order to develop what we call an anti-ableist lens to underpin their coaching knowledge. Now, this approach is really complex and really hard to achieve. It requires multi-sector organizational buy-in and commitment, and it requires a big group of people to work together to make it happen. Now, looking ahead, I think there are still a number of challenges that remain in order to address the impact of ableism, and in particular enlightened ableism, in para-coaching and coach education. One of the first challenges is at a pedagogical level. How do we best facilitate knowledge development in relation to disability? And I see that Professor Diane Culver is in the room, and she's done some really nice work with her group around social learning theory and facilitating communities of practice in parasport. Those sorts of things are really interesting and really useful for us as we build our understandings of paracoach development. Second, a challenge for paracoach education is related to the ways in which enlightened ableism manifests itself in coach education. If we continue to position disability as external to and separate from the real world, in air quotes, of coaching, this just reinforces the notion that disabled people are other and that they sit at the margins of sport. And this gives coaches the choice to either value inclusion or not. Also, the way that enlightened ableism works, it appears in coaching, and much like in physical education, that there's an unstated expectation that people with impairments don't become coaches. And so organizations, sports organizations in particular, should consider the pathways into coaching and coach development for disabled people. Practically, infusion approaches require, again, as I said, significant buy-in and commitment from researchers, from sports organizations, from disabled communities in order to reform coach education. And finally, I think for researchers, there's a real methodological challenge to develop these approaches with the communities that it intends to serve. Coach development often follows an expertise approach to the development of coaching frameworks, and the politics of disability demands that we take a participatory approach to developing disability coach education. And this can help us, if we address these kind of challenges, this can help us to avoid situations like the one on the slide where we've got coaches who are using disability sport as a stepping stone and are not valuing true inclusion. Now, again, if you do want more info and you want to read the research behind these coach development issues, please do follow the QR code. One of my co-authors, again, Professor Diane Culver, is in the room, so I'm sure she's got some thoughts for you to pick her brain. Some of the stuff in my autism evaluation is pretty shocking, so I would encourage you just at least to engage with some of the data within that. I'm happy to take any questions. I know that there's a panel discussion afterwards. Hopefully I've raised a few questions for that panel. Again, the QR code here provides some detail around the recent partnership with Sport New Zealand, where we're looking towards developing an infusion framework in New Zealand. Thank you all again for listening. You can catch me on email or on socials, or, you know, I'd love to come to Canada at some point. That'd be amazing. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Fantastic presentation, and thank you for including the QR codes. That's definitely haven't seen that done yet. So thank you for all the additional information. I would like to take a moment to introduce our panelist. Tara Chisholm is the head coach of the Canada's national women's para ice hockey team. She joined the Canadian national program in 2013 and serves as a founding board member of Women's Para Hockey of Canada. Tara has extensive coaching background, as she has been coaching able-bodied hockey since 2001 and para ice hockey since 2008. Her coaching experience ranges from first contact grassroots level to working with elite para ice hockey athletes at an international level. Along with Derek Whitson, two-time Canadian Paralympian in the sport of para ice hockey, she has developed a grassroots coaching manual for para ice hockey and become a certified coach facilitator for para ice hockey in Canada. Tara has also supported a number of IPC and World Para Ice Hockey programs around the world. Aside from her work with para ice hockey, Tara earned a Master of Arts degree in adapted physical activity at the University of Alberta, Canada. Her research, which studied the barriers and facilitators to physical activity for adults with disabilities in rural communities, led her to starting her own nonprofit organization to promote grassroots level para sports in her own community. I was also hoping to introduce Morgan Bird, who is going to be a second panelist. However, unfortunately, she had to send her regrets quite last minute as something else came up today. So I'm going to pause for a moment, open the floor. If anybody has any questions in terms of Rob's presentation or in terms of parasport coaching, please feel free to ask those, and we'll let Rob and Tara take a stab at answering those. Jen, I see you've raised your hand.
Hi, everyone. Rob, thank you so much for your presentation. I've read your work over the years, but I've never heard you speak about it, so that was really great. I'm not sure if this fits, but this is something that we've been struggling with a bit at the Stedward Center, as we're looking to opportunities to really move forward with like supporting high performance experiences for athletes with disabilities and developing our coaches kind of on the high performance stream, but also trying to maintain kind of the recreational development side of things. And I just thought I'd put it out there, either Tara or Rob, if you have any thoughts around how to sort of manage coach and athlete development in terms of supporting like the higher performance side of things, but also maintaining opportunities under the recreational development side.
It's a great question. I think, thank you, Jen, for your feedback as well. I think, look, that's one of the key, that's not a problem that's unique to Canada. That's something that systems here in New Zealand, in the UK, in Europe are trying to figure out. And so I'm part of a project at the moment across the European Union where we developed a coach development framework to try and address those different levels of the coaching pathway. What we tend to see is that in high performance parasport, often coaches end up in Paralympic sport based on extensive experience of high performance able-bodied sport, and they tend to be, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but they tend to be led by a medical model of disability in particular, because impairment plays much more of a defining role in performance, in classification, in day-to-day training. And so for those coaches who often, have gone through a pathway, they're master coaches, they might be at the top level of their qualification pathway. It's impairment and those conversations with the support staff around them, as well as the athlete, that are the really important, they're the crux of performance, really. Whereas and so it's kind of defining their learning needs. So what is it as a high performance coach that I need to know, as opposed to a coach who is working in the community sector and wants to be more inclusive in their day-to-day practice. I think what we tend to see is that in community sport, you might be working with athletes with higher support needs potentially, which actually places quite a high demand on coaches' knowledge, their skills, their practices. And so an understanding of inclusion and those different adaptive practice repertoires and frameworks, that's actually really, really important, because you end up with coaches who are predominantly volunteers or at the lower end of a qualification pathway, who are suddenly faced with a really wide range of athletes with support needs. And so it's just, for me, it would be, right, let's define what their learning needs are at these different levels, and let's try and create some opportunities for kind of cross-code or cross-sector dialogue. Often that coaches who are working at high performance level in parasport, they've got heaps of experience in parasport, they've got many, many years, and they can pass on these golden tips and tricks. But yeah, the situation you've described is that consequence of this fragmented coach development system. And I don't know, it's going to take a few years at least for us to make any kind of headway into that. I can't answer your question. I'm sorry. I'm just waffling them.
That's okay. Thank you for your thoughts. I appreciate it.
We had a question popped into the chat. What are your views on incoming or inexperienced para coaches feeling the need to learn about various disabilities in order to feel more confident as a parasport coach? And the second part, what advice would you give them to feel more confident or competent to coach?
Okay. I think it's totally understandable. If you're working with any athlete, you need to understand their needs, right? Any model of athlete-centered coaching asks you to look at the biopsychosocial aspects of athlete development. And so I absolutely advocate for an understanding of impairment. My problem is when your understanding of coaching is being led by impairment and you're prescribing how to coach people based on, well, this is how you coach athletes with cerebral palsy, or this is how you coach athletes with autism, which is typically what we see in those categorical frameworks. So I think first and foremost, if you're working with athletes and you want to know more about impairment, talk to them, ask them. It seems like a really stupid and really simple thing to say, but often coaches will go away and learn all this stuff and then come back and then impose their expectations on those athletes. So I think it's really important to build a dialogue with athletes, with their support network, with their family. Those are really, really important. And then you can start to learn a bit more widely about, well, this is the impact of an impairment on day-to-day training, on classification, on recovery cycles, those sorts of things. So yeah, impairment's important, but it shouldn't be the defining point of coaches' knowledge. The second question was around how to. I'm sorry.
What advice would you give to the coaches to feel more confident or competent to coach?
Yeah, I think I would say just jump in and get stuck in, but that's one of the issues that I've highlighted in my presentation. I think access to experienced coaches is gold dust. People who do it day to day, people who have been involved for many, many years. That mentoring aspect of coaching is underdeveloped in parasport, and it's something that I think can really, really be harnessed. And so, yeah, my early experiences of working in parasport, I was supposed to be working with a mentor. That mentor never showed up, and I had to kind of bumble my way through some community sessions. And I think that if we can have some kind of formalized mentoring practice in parasport, then we'll see a lot more coaches transitioning from, again, mainstream, for lack of a better word, sport and sport coaching into para coaching contexts.
Or do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think actually jumping back to maybe the last question with Jen that adds to this piece is Dr. Townsend mentioned around how high performance coaches often are supporting athletes who maybe don't have as high of support needs. But I would argue that that's a creation of the environment of high performance coaching, is that I find a lot of high performance coaches that come from the able-bodied world, they deselect athletes with high support needs. Whereas, like, for example, I had an athlete brand new to my team this year, or inviting her out to selection camp, and she's a young athlete. She's 15 years old, and she was not sure she could come. And I said, okay, what are some of the barriers that are in your way from coming? And she said, well, I have a medical procedure I have to do every day, and I'm not confident in doing it myself, so I have to have support from my father. And I know that you don't allow parents in the sport area. And so I don't think I can come. And I, being around the sport for a long time, said, I didn't call it out to her, but I said, oh, that's okay. I said, this is a learning opportunity for us. I, for example, have lots of other athletes that, have to do a bowel and bladder routine every day. And her shoulders just went from here to there, and said, that's what it is. It's a bowel routine. And I don't know how to do it on my own. I didn't think I could talk to you. And I said, I'm different than other coaches within the space that you might experience. But the reality is that she was not going to come because she thought that she wouldn't be supported with something that is so critical for her to be able to come and participate fully in a high performance setting. So I think there's a bit of this elitism that happens within high performance coaching and high performance sport that doesn't allow some of our best athletes to feel comfortable being themselves in these settings. And we miss opportunities to have really amazing people representing our countries because of just this lack of openness, awareness, communication around some of these topics. So yes, I mean, within my grassroots programming, I definitely have a lot of athletes with high support needs, but I would say with high performance coaching, we're weeding it out because of the lack of openness and opportunity that high performance coaches are not taking right now.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And it's something that, so some of the work that's coming out of our little research group addresses that. We're looking at is because it's essentially an athlete welfare issue. If an organization and its coaching staff are not equipped or prepared or have any understanding of how to enact care for these athletes, then that's a welfare issue. And so one of my PhD students, Amanda, she has been in some high performance programs as an athlete. She was really highly classified at one point. So, she was a medal contender, was then declassified, didn't become a medal contender anymore, and then was out of the program. But she's a C4 paraplegic. And so she has really high support needs. And many of her coaches just do not know what to do with it. They don't know how to manage her performance. They don't know how to manage her cares. And so that for her is a major, major block, because you need a barrier, because you need a carer with you full time. And not many sports organizations provide funding for you to have a carer with you full time in training environments or in performance environments. So yeah, look, that's a massive area that we need to know more about and probably need to collaborate more on.
All right, another question from the chat. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask, what would be your opinion on para-coach education on coaching for elite sports and non-elite sports? Would there be something to point out in terms of social model of disability models?
Yeah, I think so. So for me, The social model is good and it's a starting point. I think the social relational model offers more things for coaches to hang their hats on. So it's really, really important. I think at any point in the coaching pathway, whether you're a neophyte, new coach, whether you're a 30-year master coach, to continually reflect on what I've called the disabling aspects of your coaching practice. So those things can be things like your practice session, for example. So if your session is not set up for a wide range of abilities at the community level, then that can be a disabling barrier. If your attitude is, I'm not going to work with these athletes because they've got high support needs, that's a disabling barrier. If you're working with athletes with learning disabilities and you're unfamiliar with things like picture exchange communication system or Makaton, and you need to use those are disabling barriers. So that's a cornerstone, excuse me, that's a cornerstone of developing coaches' knowledge and developing those relational behaviors that I spoke about within a social relational model. So again, I often talk about one of the most profound experiences that I had as a coach was I was working at this talent development center. We were doing cricket, we were doing catching, and there was a young lad in my session who I had the players in lines because I was a really good coach at the time, and the player stepped forward to take some catches, and he had no arms. He had nothing below his elbows on both sides, and I completely froze. Right, I'm about to hit a cricket ball, which those of you that have any experience of cricket, it's a bit like a hockey ball. It's really hard. And I was about to hit this ball at this player between his sort of chest and his head to try and catch the ball, and he had no hands. And I completely froze, completely freaked out. I think I froze for probably about 5 seconds. It felt like 2 minutes. And in the end, I kind of just rolled the ball to him. He dropped down, picked it up in the crook of his arm and threw it back at me with a look of disgust. And I remember thinking, the only thing disabling that lad there in that moment and in that interaction was my assumptions about him, and then the decision that I made about the practice. What I didn't know, because I didn't take time to speak to him, was that he wore a padded vest and that he would just take it on his chest, roll with it, and then throw it back. And so that story for me is always this kind of light bulb moment of, well, that there is an example of the disabling aspects of my coaching practice. And so the social relational model offers us some really nice reflective tools around, well, what's my communication style like? You know, when I was working with the lads with learning disabilities, very quickly you knew if what you were asking them to do, they didn't understand it. You very quickly knew that because obviously whatever it is you wanted to do wasn't happening. And so I often had to reflect on, that's not their problem. That's my style, my communication style, the way that I've conveyed these messages. And so those are the things that I think we need to focus on across coach development. You know, whether you are a neophyte coach at the level 1 level or a master coach, you know, you need to continually reflect on those things. But also, so the social relational model then talks about, well, impairment effects is really important. It impacts on performance. It impacts on athletes' day-to-day lives. We need to understand that. We need to understand how it can play out in sport. Again, I think I've waffled. Sorry if I've not answered your question. But yeah, I think the social model is important, but I think we need to go further and draw on the social relational model.
One thing I would add to that piece is the way that coach education is set up in general. It's like you think of when you say who are the experts within coach education. Right now, your picture in your head probably goes to like a white middle-class man who's a settler, who's able-bodied, and that's how things are formed, like top down. So when I'm a coach facilitator for hockey, I created the pathway for para hockey because it didn't exist. But even when I go into those spaces, that's who I've been trained by. So that's like where my model comes from and what I'm supposed to deliver. And supposed to, like, as Dr. Danielle Pierce talked about in the latest Adaptive Physical Activity Conference, like retrofit people and make them fit into a system that was never designed for them to be involved in. So I'm already starting off like 10 steps backwards of my coach education delivery, because it was never intended for the people that I'm coaching in the room. And so right away, like, yes, I cover the points, and sorry for those who are here from Canadian Association of Coaching. I cover your points that I'm supposed to cover, but then I also get my ego out of the way right away and say, I'm not the only expert in this room. That those of you who have been grinding away at grassroots level para hockey for years and years and years, you are the experts who are going to bring a whole bunch of knowledge to this session today, that hopefully something you say is going to resonate with somebody from this club over here. You're going to build a relationship, and you two are now going to enhance your own coaching network. And it's not from this 4-hour class that I'm delivering on this content for you kind of thing, because that's where we're at right now. In para hockey anyways, I can't speak to the other para sport coach education, but it very much comes from an ableist lens right off the bat. So we're working within systems that are not helping our coaches in para sport to develop, because it was never intended for them to be a part of.
Question directed to Tara. As someone involved in para ice hockey, a sport with Paralympic and non-Paralympic opportunities that are determined by gender, have you seen any really successful practices that support the development of the women's game and coach and or athlete learning and experiences?
Yes. So one of the things that we developed with Women's Para Hockey of Canada, so not the NSO, not Hockey Canada, but Women's Para Hockey, was anytime a woman makes the national team, I offer coach education to her. And then we started a mentorship program across the country. So it's not just my national team members, because I don't believe it's just my high performance athletes who have the ability to deliver quality coaching to their communities, but any woman who wants to get involved in coaching, with or without a disability, we educate. Because the reality of being a disabled woman is that you are going to be looked at as though you do not have power and expertise when you walk or wheel into an arena. So we want to make sure that there's a piece of paper, something that they can say, hey, you can't tell me to get off the ice, or you can't tell me that I'm not allowed to be here, because I've done the education and I have a right to be here and I have a right to lead. So that's kind of where we are at right now, but it gives a pathway in, so that more women with disabilities can have opportunities to lead, because as we know, if we have a woman with a disability on the ice leading a session, and whether it be someone of any gender, seeing that, that's going to change that perspective of who can be a leader within the sport. So the more opportunities that we have to educate and certify girls and women with disabilities across Canada to be in leadership positions, the better for our sport. And it also selfishly helps our organization, because it means I'm not traveling across Canada running programming in every country. Our women can work locally within their own communities, and build partnerships and relationships and spread things way quicker, more economically than we could ever have if we just have one person doing it. So that's been something that we've really focused on in the last 5 years, I would say.
Rob, do you have any additional thoughts for that one? Next question. Tara, you have been a strong supporter of connecting para athletes on your teams to coaching pathways and opportunities, as you just mentioned. Disabled coaches are still so woefully few and far between in the Canadian system, in large part to ableist structures and so many barriers. Can you speak to how you have worked to provide that support and how athletes have responded to accessing those opportunities? I think you've covered most of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of just saying like, screw you to the current structures and systems that exist. We still experience ableism all the time. I mean, just this past year, my husband, who is a 2-time Paralympian and coaches from a sled, who's my assistant coach, he was told that he couldn't coach a team because he coached from a sled. So, and that was in Canada. And you would assume from 10 years of experience working with our national team with me and 10 years of experience as an athlete, he wouldn't have to experience that within the sport, but he did. And I'm currently actually working with one of my athletes, Peggy Asink, or Dr. Peggy Asink, who's in England right now, doing her postdoctoral work. And she is got a meeting next week talking to the English Ice Hockey Association, who will not allow a coach who does not coach from skates to be coaching in their system or take the coaching certification. So, there's still a lot of barriers that we have to look at and address in the sense of, why is that there? What's the actual reasoning? And it can't be, that's just the way it's been done. That's just the way it is. Like, that's not a good enough excuse. So continuing to kind of break down and like I say, screw you to the systems that are holding the power right now and finding ways to do it anyways. And then, having athletes mentor, like Dr. Townsend said, that's a big part of it is making sure that if athletes want access to the knowledge that I have, that there's time given and space afforded so that they can come and shadow and work. And then slowly I step out of the way and they come in more. Because that would be my goal, is to one day have a disabled woman coaching the women's national team and not me.
What is your advice on how to move from integration to inclusion in a high performance environment in individual sports where Paralympic athletes must train side by side and with able-bodied athletes who are not really interested in addressing the different needs of differently abled persons?
Tara, do you want to take this one?
You go ahead. I feel like I've chatted a lot, so you go ahead. I've got some things actually after you talk about even within disability itself, because I've had to address this within my team, but I'll let you speak first, Dr. Townsend.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you down because I don't really know. I think that's a really interesting dilemma. It kind of begs the question of whether integration is truly something that you want to work for in those kind of situations, and to what end. I suppose, again, the advice would be you need to start working back, and you need to work with your coaches to understand, well, why aren't you building this picture of these athletes in terms of their needs? Why aren't you understanding ways in which to center their needs in that coaching environment? And also, I think it comes back to the way that ableism kind of structures our understandings of performance. It's that devaluation of para-athlete performance versus able-bodied performance. And I think that, some of the most powerful reflective exercises might be to challenge that and just say, well, what about it? What about what they're doing is not high performance to you? And those sorts of things. So I think that's a fantastic question. I just don't know the answer. I'm sorry. So Tara, you take it away.
So it's a little bit off of this question, but I coach a team sport, and within para hockey, we have athletes of varying impairments within my sport, and we had a lot of difficulty with this. Before the pandemic, we had athletes that were struggling. They share hotel rooms, they share dressing room spaces, they're together all the time at camp. And, for my athlete with a below knee amputation versus an athlete with a high level spinal cord injury, sometimes there's a bit of communication issues that occur because they don't understand, well, why are they taking so much time in the morning? Like, they're my roommate, I need time in the washroom too. Or, why isn't this athlete who has an acquired brain injury, and they might not know this athlete has an acquired brain injury, not getting our systems that you're teaching? Like, it's simple. You've taught us through video, you've taught us through, on the ice work, you've sat down with us, we've gone through it with them. They're not understanding this. So what we've done is we've had conversations. So pandemic was a beautiful thing in a way, because we talked with our athletes and said, if you are comfortable, we'd like to have an opportunity, a little session, and it wasn't mandatory. Anyone was welcome to attend. And if you don't mind talking a little bit around your support needs. So for my athletes with learning disabilities, they came on a Zoom call just like this, and they talked around how they learn. I had athletes who opened up and talked about their bowel and bladder routines, not in specific details, but talked a little bit around process so that their teammates could understand, why it might take them a bit longer or what spaces they need. But all of these things allowed our athletes to build some empathy and understanding of, this is how I can be a good teammate, not just on the ice, passing them the puck, but off the ice too, and supporting them, and knowing that, if they need support or help, I have a bit of a perspective or understanding as to why this is. So they weren't necessarily easy conversations by any means, and it took a lot of bravery from those athletes that were willing to share, but it definitely built stronger and deeper connections and a level of respect that wasn't there beforehand. Because it can be difficult. And as a coach, I'm not in a position to disclose information as to why an athlete might be doing certain things in a certain way. So it was really up to my athletes' vulnerability to talk about this in a way that was comfortable for them, and for their teammates to ask questions. So I could potentially see that maybe working within other spaces too, but that was within a team environment.
Tara, did you by chance see any athletes who maybe weren't willing to open up and share right at the start of that, change their mind later on?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting because our athletes with amputations, they often in our space within para hockey, and I've heard this in para sport in general, like they pass as more able. And so they sometimes those athletes struggle, but then once our athletes started to talk about pressure sores or started to talk about different things that were medical in nature that might have an effect on, they have to take so many days off of training, we had our athletes with amputations start talking about some of their stump care routines. And then this whole little group formed of all my athletes with amputations that then talked about good creams to use and what to say to your prosthetist. And this little group formed where if we didn't have that conversation with our individuals with spinal cord injury, they wouldn't have even thought of oh, actually, this kind of happens to me and I manage this on my own. I never talk about it to anybody, but this could actually really help out somebody else who has a similar impairment to me. So it created a really good community because not many other spaces within their lives, I've been told, do my athletes have somebody that's like them, like a 30-some-year-old woman with an amputation that enjoys sport. So they said they weren't really taking advantage of the community that was right in front of them to learn and grow, and all these tips that they just stuck to hockey before this. And now they're kind of expanding their conversations into other points in their life. And we've done that not just within impairment, but we've also had conversations on all sorts of topics, even on dating and on, experiencing, different social aspects of being an individual living with an impairment. And we have many intersectionalities on our team too. So we've had communities of, the LGBTQ plus community on our team that has talked around their experiences, the BIPOC community who's talked around their experiences as a woman living with a disability, also having that intersectionality. So these conversations that were created because it was Zoom and we were looking for more ways to connect and understand and build relationships actually ended up being a really good thing in the end.
Thank you. Ashley, just before I come to you, there's one more comment in the chat, and I'll just give Rob and Tara a second to respond to it. So comment is, I guess there are overarching sport biases here that create barriers, and I have trouble relating to them. In archery coach education training, you are supposed to adapt the sport to find ways to have athletes and coaches become involved and thrive. Is there anything either of you would like to contribute to that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that's a really progressive position to be in, and I think the comment is spot on in that there are some cultures that are entrenched and that in which ableism is more entrenched potentially, and so there are inherited belief systems about the way the sport should be played or the way the sport should be performed, that makes it hard to fit athletes with impairments into those kind of belief systems. So yeah, I think that those are the sorts of things that in coach development pathways that we should be asking coaches to reflect on. You know, we should be asking coaches to reflect on the way that ability influences their practice design and how that they can differentiate that for different needs, and basically placing that person that you're working with at the forefront of your consideration. So yeah, look, on the one hand, it's really good that that's the archery's approach, but it's just as you said, as you rightly said, I think it's Kathleen. Yeah, there are those entrenched sports cultures which will take time.
Okay, Ashley.
Well, first, Letitia, I just want to thank Robert and Tara so much for joining us today and contributing to the Calgary Adapted Hub's race seminars, as well as all the folks that are joining us from the National Coaching for Parasport Summit. That this maybe just is, as Tim was hoping, this maybe is igniting a little bit of the energy heading into that week. So my question is around that. Rob, when you mentioned infusion frameworks, I think that that's all work that we're interested in doing, especially the conversations that we've been having after one of our latest symposia. But what I'd really like both of your perspectives on is who do we want to make sure is at the table to make sure that that truly is an infusion framework, and that again the conversation isn't maybe the same traditional conversations that are being had. I also heard in Tara's just last comment there really around our ISTs or our allied health professionals that are supporting this as well. So maybe any advice that both of you have as step one for some of that infusion framework work that I'll go on.
Sarah, do you want to lead off?
Sure. I mean, like the obvious answer, I believe, is, to have individuals living with impairments involved, but not just involved, but like leading, and not leading at we're going to run a workshop or, a think tank session, like leading at the decision-making level, at the top level, because we're going to just continue to just turn our wheels if we try to force. Dr. Lisa Tink talks around, you can't have true inclusion by trying to force people into a system that was never created or intended for them. So I think that's where, for coach education and the future of parasport, we're going to have to really test what that looks like in the creation of it. I'm not saying scrap it altogether. Obviously, there's amazing things around coach education, but we have to look at a lens, and I don't think you can really look at it through a different lens of somebody like me who doesn't experience impairment on a daily basis. So we need those that have that lens to be in those positions. And right now they're barrier to being in those positions. So we as a collective, as a community, need to make sure that that space is created so that we have individuals living with impairment in those top level decision-making situations within our coach education streams.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that, Tara, you nailed it earlier when you said that coach education is delivered by a certain type of person, and that person is what we can see and what we can be in coach education, basically, white, male, cis, all those sorts of things. So yeah, so coach developers who are, as Tara said, have lived experience of impairment, really, really important. That's the starting point. If we're attaching research to the development of these frameworks, then we have advisory structures here. So disabled groups, athletes, coaches who sit on an advisory structure and are involved in all aspects of the design and the delivery of such frameworks and those sorts of things. So again, not having that tokenistic consultation partner, but having those people drive it, again, as Tara said, driving those questions and those answers is crucial. There is also, so we want disabled people leading those initiatives. We also should start to think a bit more out the box and outside of our discipline in coaching. So there are multidisciplinary teams and multidisciplinary knowledges that we can draw on to inform our program content, for example. So one of my PhD students is a qualified speech and language therapist, and she's bringing that lens to her development of a co-production framework and infusion framework in coaching, where her focus is on communication and language and how we're actually interacting with people at that relational level. So those sorts of things are gold. And it's so often coaching gets stuck in its silos and people just work in their own little cultures, where we need to start thinking outside the box a little bit and working together. It sounds so corny because we always say that, but we never do it. Those coach development frameworks are really crucial for bringing those cross-disciplinary conversations together. What else can we do for infusion? I think a key one, and something that I do with my undergraduates in coaching, is I ask them to define disability, and I ask them to then match their definitions to models of disability. And very quickly they realize where lots of their thinking is anchored in. And so it's just one exercise and it's just a reflective thing, but straight away you're starting to expose those ableist foundations of what is disability and how does that shape my thinking about how to work with these people. And often it's working on them, not with them. So yeah, those are the key messages for me. I think Tara absolutely nailed it.
All right, do we have one more question? All right. Well, in that case, I would like to thank Rob for your presentation, for all the comments you've made, and Tara as well for the panel discussion. Thank you very much, both of you. I would like to, I'll just pop it in the chat here, is the link to the National Coaching for Parasport Summit, in case anybody has missed it or would like to take a look. Hopefully we'll see everybody there in a couple of days. And otherwise, have a great day.
Thank you. And Letitia, I'll send you the slides as well so you can share them with anyone that's interested.
Sounds good. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.